Hopefully that made sense. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to go into single sign-on, and we're going to jump straight into sort of discussing the challenge that we've got. Another challenge that we've got in this sort of new sort of cloud world that we're in now. A lot of organisations, I'm assuming that a lot of you guys are in at the minute as well. So one of the challenges that we've got with single sign-on, with our environment right now, is the fact that we've got a lot of software as a service environments and a lot of software as a service products, and they're obviously going to keep coming. We're going to get more of them. It's the new way of working. So most businesses will use social media for their business now. They'll be using possibly a software as a service CRM such as Salesforce. We use a platform called Breathe, which is a HR platform, which is again software as a service. So you can imagine the type of information that's stored in those sort of platforms are very sensitive. Most organizations like us, we have like an old test environment that we use, which is like a legacy, which we class as like legacy web apps as well. And obviously we use an Office 365. So the challenge that we've got in this sort of scenario is, one, it's just very inconvenient for a user because they've got many sets of credentials, got different credentials for all these different platforms. It's just a little bit inconvenient from actually a user experience perspective. But the bigger sort of problem is the security risk. It's managing all of the identities and all of the credentials for each of these environments. And what you've got there is a problem when you've got people leaving the business in particular. So if someone leaves, you need to make sure that you disable all their accounts on all these different platforms. And if that isn't done or that process isn't robust and we can't rely on it and it's manual, which when it's manual, you will have some. Obviously, you'll always have that one mistake, that one error where someone still gets left who still has access to a platform. So the challenge there is what you don't want to have a situation where you have someone leaving the business, particularly if it's a disgruntled employee who still has access to one of these platforms, and that could very easily happen in this sort of new sort of cloud software as a service world that we're living in now. So what are we going to do about that in terms of Microsoft? What Microsoft give us? What tools have they give us to help solve this problem? And they've created this Azure single sign-on, which is a part of Azure AD Premium. And what this allows us to do is to tie our Office 365 identity, our Azure AD login, to our external third-party applications. And the way it does that is it uses multiple sort of methods, multiple technical methods. And the first one it uses is the sort of new protocol, which is the OpenID Connect and OAuth protocol, which most new applications will use. It's much easier to manage. If you are building any applications, if you're owning software as service applications, or you've got a development team that are doing that, I would recommend that they use this method to build their application now to integrate with single sign-on or with your Azure AD identity. We've then got SAML, so any application or software as a service product that supports SAML can be integrated with your Azure AD single sign-on. But then you've got to ask the question then is, if you have an application that doesn't support these sort of methods, so maybe it's a legacy application or just one that just simply doesn't support them for whatever reason, then we do have this third option, which is the password-based single sign-on. And what that actually does is the Azure single sign-on product remembers, or basically configure it to know the login URL for that piece of software. And we also configure the credentials for each individual user and assign them to that user. And when they basically click the application within Office 365 to go to that web application, it will manually itself automatically will enter the credentials into the browser for the user. So the user never has to actually be aware of the credentials for that application. So how does it look from a user perspective? Let's take a quick look at that now. So I would literally just log into Office 365 as normal as we've seen previously. And you can see all my Office 365 apps, Outlook, OneDrive, OneNote on the left, but you can also see near the bottom, we've got this Barracuda system, Meraki, Salesforce, and yeah, the Barracuda system is like our legacy, what we're using, our legacy app just for testing for this this webinar, to be honest with you. So we'll start with Salesforce. You can see there we just clicked on Salesforce to log in straight from Office 365, ask us to confirm our identity, and it'll take us through to the Salesforce application. And at no point have I actually been asked for my Salesforce username and password. And then, as you can see, the user experience, first of all, is much better, but also the user doesn't know their credentials for Salesforce, and then they're into that application. So that's basically the case for any application that supports the SAML protocol, would have that same experience. But for a legacy app where it doesn't support SAML, how does that look? And this is where the browser is going to check as we go into the Barracuda system there. What are we logging in as? I just select my account, and then it enters my credentials for me into the form, and then I'm in the application now, and that's opened up. So now we're in the applications. That's how a legacy app would work. Okay. The important bit, I suppose, really for this sort of webinar is, what does this look like from a technical perspective? Where do we go to configure this? And how does that sort of look as well? So we're on our screen now. You can see that we've got the Azure portal. So this is where you would go to configure these products, and you would go to portal.azure.com. You'd go into Azure Active Directory, which I'm guessing a lot of people will be familiar with. And once you've opened Azure Active Directory, on the left-hand side, go to Enterprise Applications and click All Applications. And in here, you'll see a list of all the applications you've got configured, and you'll be able to add new ones as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the single sign-on section of this application here, so Barracuda, and this is where we would set up the URL and the form or the page that we'd log into. So that's the page that's at the top of the screen, which I'll show you in a second. So if we were going to just go straight to our software service application and log into it, this is the URL we would navigate to log into that application. And you can see in this particular application here, it asks for 3 fields rather than just username and password. It wants to know what sort of company we want to log into in that application. It's just some applications will require a little bit more information because that's just how they've been developed. But the interesting thing is here is what will happen is the Azure portal, when we actually configure it with this URL on this screen here, when you first configure it, it goes off and looks at that page and scans the HTML code, and it'll recognize fields that require input, such as username and password fields, and it'll remember those. And when we need to actually provide credentials for login for the users, it'll ask us for that information for each of those fields that are required, and we'll need to put that in for that user, and obviously then it'll know what credentials to use to log that user into the session. Sorry. So I'll show you where we configure the credentials now. You just go to users and groups on the left. We select the user, so we're just going to select myself here, and then we're going to go to update credentials at the top of the screen. And then once this pops up, what you actually see is you'll see those 3 fields that were recognized by Azure when it scanned the page, the HTML code. Obviously the name's slightly different because that's what they'll probably be named as in the code rather than what's being presented to the user. And you can see it's asked for the username for the user, the password, and for this one is that domain field. What it asks for, that 3rd field was actually at the bottom of the screen when we looked at the page directly. So what you can see there is it's a really intelligent system the way it works, but the main thing is the user never has to get the username and password for the system. You know, the only people who get it is the people who actually set up the user initially, input the credentials in here, and all we would do is if someone leaves the organization, disable their account, they would then lose access to this application as well as Salesforce or any other applications you've got just by disabling their Office 365 account. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, any questions, put them in. We're trying to give you guys a good sort of overview here of many products or 3 products. So we are sort of going through them fairly quickly, but the idea is that you can basically ask questions and we'll make sure we get back to you just to sort of make sure you've got a really comprehensive sort of view of these products. So one point I just want to sort of make you aware of, one of the additional benefits of using Azure Single Sign-On is we've covered multi-factor authentication and conditional access earlier, well, mainly conditional access, but MFA is certainly related. If you've got applications, obviously, that are using single sign-on with Azure AD, all of those applications are going to be protected by your conditional access policies and any multi-factor authentication that you've got in place. So that's really handy because obviously you need to log into 365 first to be able to actually click and open these third-party apps. So if you've got applications that maybe don't support MFA themselves, or their security isn't great in terms of restricting where people log in from and that sort of thing, then you don't need to worry about that. You can still use applications and use the Microsoft MFA and conditional access sort of settings to add that additional layer to applications which probably otherwise you couldn't get that level of security for. So definitely keep that in mind when you're sort of considering using this product.